Hey everybody, this is Nevin with the Patriotic Populist. Today I'm going to be hosting, I think, about two solo podcast commentaries. Got my trusty cup of coffee. Normally Herschel has his coffee because it's late at night, but here in sunny South Florida, it's 4:12 in the afternoon. I'm having a nice hot cup of freshly brewed Cafe Bustelo coffee. Now, Cafe Bustelo is probably one of the best coffees, and I take my coffee black. It's perfect. It gives me a nice caffeine boost, and definitely allows my brain cells to work even further. So I've had a kind of a long day today. Cleaned the entire apartment, did a lot of laundry, took a 4 mile walk. Yes, 4 mile walk. I'm very much an exercise enthusiast. I do weightlifting, working out, pre-pandemic. I belong to Planet Fitness gym here in Coral Springs, which is where I live in South Florida. But since March 2020, I've worked out at home, bought a whole bunch of exercise equipment from Amazon.com or through Amazon.com. And to tell you the truth, I like working out at home. I get to do all my exercises, my weights, my crunches, my walks, lickety split. Or I wouldn't say lickety split, but at least I don't have to wait for equipment or anything else. So I had a very productive day, relaxed, cooked myself a nice lunch, avocado, a little bit of brown rice, a chicken drumstick, and a pork chop with a Coke Zero. So a good breakfast, or rather a good lunch, and now I'm kind of in the mood to do a podcast for at least for the next hour or so. So today I want to talk about why I'm not a Marxist. Herschel Miller, my co-host, co-founder of the Patriotic Populist, is clearly an anti-communist, as I am very much against Marxism. But let me make a very key distinction. What I disagree with Karl Marx on in the whole communist program is many of their solutions. I don't necessarily disagree with all of Marx's analysis. Now, just because he was a shitty person, shitty to his family, and really did not leave the most ideal personal life, that doesn't detract from some of the legitimate criticisms of uncontrolled capitalism that Karl Marx had. And a lot of our problems here in the United States are class-based. Now, is it to say that every member of the bourgeoisie or every rich person is an exploiter? No, because there are many different shades of capitalism. There are many different shades of capitalists. You have ones that are very paternalistic and, they do the right thing by their employees, their investors, the community, and even the nation. And wealthy people who are like that really should not be penalized or demonized. It's people like Paul Singer, the Walton family, I hate to say it, even Sam Walton, when you take a closer look at his business model and some of his opinions regarding union and his usage of foreign imports, even from China. Yes, it actually started under Sam quietly. When you look at those individuals, when you look at a whole slew, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, when you look at their employment practices, when you look at their employment practices, some of them also are heavily involved in investing with enemies of the United States. For example, the Walton family and Jeff Bezos, for example, are very, very well known for their heavy presence in the People's Republic of China, not exactly a friend of capitalism or the United States for that matter. But let's go down and let's examine a little bit what in Marx's writings is so objectionable. Now, one thing I used to believe in is this notion that Marxism and Leninism and Stalinism and Maoism were different things, that Stalinism, Maoism, even Leninism were a departure of Marx. But in the fall of 1993, I took a political science class at SUNY Albany, which is where I got a double major in history, graduated with departmental honors, and also majored in political science. And I read the Communist Manifesto. It was Professor Livingston's class. He was an excellent political science professor. It was Poli-Sci 101. And I'm glad he assigned it. In fact, I think most youths, college students, should read Marx, because the more astute college students, I would hope, will read it, particularly the back portion of the book where Karl Marx lays out his program, his communist program. And if any reasonable individual reads that, they're going to be repelled by Marxism. Not because of his critique of capitalism, because what he wants to see imposed on the world. I mean, Marx is a disreputable character personally. He was a vile racist. He did not like Jews, even though he was born Jewish. Sad irony. Just got to get my sip of Joe there. Okay, Marx is really disturbing. He wrote in the Communist Manifesto, and we're just going to go over some facts and we'll talk about it. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all elements of production in the hands of the state, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. He actually wrote that the proletarian revolution would actually triumph as a result of this new revolutionary government that would, or as he termed it, a dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, they would then implement what Marx said himself, despotic inroads on the rights of property. He called for in his communist program, Karl Marx, it's in the his manifesto, call for the abolition of property and land, the confiscation of all immigrants and rebels, meaning the squashing of all internal opposition to the revolution, centralization of credit in the hands of the state, which means no private sector participation in the financial affairs of the nation. He means, not merely just having a state. See, let me back up here. What radical civic nationalists, at least I could speak for myself, support is, yes, a state-owned bank, very similar to what Alexander Hamilton called for example, or what they have in North Dakota example, which works very, very well. What I call for is, excuse me, just checking my messages to make sure that nobody's calling me or texting me. I would personally be for, and I would think radical civic nationalists, even Herschel, would be for having a national bank. As I said, I would call it the third national bank. And what its purpose would be is to disperse, amongst other things, credit to reindustrialize the United States, to rebuild infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Karl Marx does not want any private banking. I personally, speaking for myself, have no problem outside of the national bank having lots of commercial banks, a very competitive commercial banking system, and a highly regulated investment banking system that disincentivizes flat-out financial speculation, the paper casino economy, as it's known as, and it would be investments more towards production, research and development, and things of that nature. So he also called for the centralization of the means of communication in the hands of the state. Well, that opens the door to a real censorship of ideas, especially since Karl Marx is calling for despotic inroads on the rights of property, as he termed it. That's going to create a lot of opposition, and that really and truly could create a civil war. And of course, the state would have to become authoritarian, which means massive censorship. The establishment of industrial armies, which is incidentally what Lenin and Trotsky imposed as part of the Bolshevik program. It's kind of almost a slave labor force. And also the combination of education with industrial production. Of course, my concern would be in a Marxist variant of authoritarianism. That would be simply, I would interpret it as the possibility of the imposition of cheap child labor in the newly nationalized factories. So now, there were people on the left and patriotic populists that knew that Marxian variant of socialism is simply slavery. When you impose it, the actual program he calls for himself is slavery. I mean, I just read you all the things, what's going on. I mean, let's back up for a moment. Karl Marx's ideas for the creation of this new dictatorship of the proletariat, which would supposedly wither away, the state would wither away and usher in the perfect communist society. Well, I got to tell you something. At least here in the United States, for better or for worse, and I would say in many ways for better, we're attached to our private property. You know, we're talking about many small factory owners. We're talking about store owners, you know, the neighborhood store that you may remember from growing up. And other small enterprises, the local barbershop, the local salon. I mean, these are really and truly pillars of the community. They are important pillars of the community. And you have people here in the United States and other parts of the world that really do have an entrepreneurial instinct. And there's nothing innately wrong with that. That's how people can create livelihoods for themselves and their families, and in partnership, hopefully with their workers, create new products and services and everything else. That is a natural phenomenon. That is not a bad phenomenon. And when capitalism is properly managed, it is truly a progressive force in free societies. You know, there's no issue. I have no issue with the general outline of principles of capitalism and free enterprise. It's when it's unconstrained and when there are no safeguards against greed, self-destructive greed. That's when there's a problem. But the other end of the spectrum, Marxism or fascism, today we're talking about Marxism, is really not the panacea for this. It's clearly not. Teddy Roosevelt predicted that socialism, according to Marx, and he was later an opponent of Bolshevism before he passed away, he said that Marx's socialism was, quote, essentially based on the immediate annihilation of personal ownership of capital, and in the near future, the annihilation of the family. Marx was very much against the family. He infamously said, abolish the family. Another very unnatural, scientifically totalitarian principle. And then Teddy Roosevelt said that, and ultimately the annihilation of civilization. So let me read that again. Teddy Roosevelt, one of our heroes, believed that Marx's socialism was, quote, essentially based on the immediate annihilation of personal ownership of capital, and in the near future, the annihilation of the family, and ultimately the annihilation of civilization. He predicted that, quote, doctrinaire socialism would result in a, quote, iron despotism over all workers, compared to which any slave system of the past would seem beneficent. Well, there's not much I could argue with that. Now, if you're a pro-communist, or if you're a communist, or you're just an hardened anti-American or a hardened anti-capitalist, this is not going to resonate with you, generally speaking. And to be honest with you, patriotic populism and the Marxist program is really not compatible. Now, another fellow who I'm not crazy about, but his predictions were spot on about Marxism, Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, he predicted that a government administered according to Marxist principles would be, quote, the most aristocratic, despotic, arrogant, and elitist of all regimes. And all I have to say is take a look at the Soviet Union and the Soviet-style governments that succeeded the dictatorship of Mikhail Gorbachev. All Soviet-style regimes, all part of that communist or Marxist-Leninist culture, still in Russia today. You have China, you have Cuba, you have Venezuela, you have Zimbabwe, you have Vietnam, North Korea, I think I said China already, Nicaragua, which is now back under the Sandinistas. And there are other sort of socialist dictatorships that I'm sure I'm missing right here. But you get the point. These regimes are highly aristocratic, despotic, arrogant, and elitist. I mean, they really are. They're very convinced of the global communist victory, of global anti-American revolution. They crush their populations. There's tremendous corruption. It's not to say that the United States does not have problems. We talk about the problems of the United States, but this is where we separate ourselves from the far left, is that we don't just whitewash, major adversaries of the United States. We don't blame the CIA and the U.S. for every single global problem that exists. Not to say that they didn't have their hands in the cookie jar of world problems, but we have our eyes open to exactly the machinations of enemies like Russia and China, communist or these sort of communist-style dictatorships. Marxism, Leninism, developed. A lot of this became the reality of Marxist-Leninist dictatorship, starting in Bolshevik Russia, Soviet Russia in November of 1917. Immediate annihilation of personal ownership of capital, annihilation of the family, annihilation of civilization, iron despotism over the workers. Teddy Roosevelt and Mikhail Bakunin were absolutely 110% correct. Their predictions were correct. And what's very concerning to Herschel and I is you have the growth of communism. And part of that is because since the 1960s, and this really started to explode by the 1980s, you have professors that believe in Marx and social sciences departments, and they were teaching social sciences from a Marxist perspective. Bertil Ohlmann even admitted in the 1980s, he was a famous Marxist professor. He said that, during the 1980s, during the supposed Reagan Revolution, that actually Marxism became more appealing on the campuses. That's not a good thing, according to the views on this podcast. It's not. Now, otherwise good anti-communist analysts like J.R. Nyquist, they'll say, well, it's because the kids have been dumbed down, that the professors are Marxists and they're manipulating, gullible college students and, high school students. All that might be true, but there are deeper reasons for this. And the reason why, one of the biggest reasons why that Marxism is gaining, and even communism in some cases, is gaining more and more appeal in kind of a disorganized fashion here in the United States, is because corporate capitalism, unregulated teabagger, globalist, unrestrained corporate capitalism has been failing the United States. There's a deep chasm between the rhetoric of achieving the American dream versus the reality. And our show is going to continue to pound on that. So I'm not going to go off on a tangent on why the American dream is very difficult for average people to attain. I'm not going to go over that. But let me give you a quote by Danny Haiphong. His political views are pretty odious because he is a champion of communist China. He's been on the Jimmy Dore show, and he just spews this pro-China apologia that really is kind of sickening. But you also have to have a little empathy and a little common sense here, and integrity, intellectual integrity. You have to ask the question, well, why? Why would people embrace and act as apologists, propagandists for odious dictatorships? Well, in the case of Danny Haifang, he was a writer for the Workers' World newspaper, Workers' World Party newspaper titled Workers' World. The Workers' World Party is a Trotskyite organization, it's a communist group. They've championed for decades many anti-American dictatorships. He's also affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America. He is basically a self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist who praised contemporary communist China. In fact, when Danny Haifang was on the Jimmy Dore show, he's been on the Jimmy Dore show on several occasions. On Dore's YouTube videos, I mean, there are people and leftists who will basically blast Haifang, saying China is corrupt, it's totalitarian or authoritarian, it's threatening government and all the rest of it. So, there are divisions on the left, and not every single leftist is a communist or a communist apologist. We have to have nuance when it comes to criticizing the left too as well. This is one of the things I disagree with a lot of anti-communist analysts who are really good and well-informed and educated like J.R. Nyquist. They kind of unconsciously, at least this is my observation, lump all leftists together when they discuss left-wing politics and the intentions of the left. So, Haifang is clearly a hardline Marxist-Leninist. But he was pushed to communism partially because of the failure of trickle-down economics and how it affected his family. And in an interview, Haifang recalled, quote, "I grew up in a working-class community in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My father was a white union worker for the federal government. My mother was a Vietnamese woman who has consistently struggled with mental health issues and has thus struggled with employment. After the elimination of Glass-Steagall, which was an act that was implemented by FDR in 1933 or 34, is officially called the Banking Act. It put a firewall between commercial and investment banks. But anyways, after the and it really kind of controlled the financial speculation craze. After the elimination of Glass-Steagall, banks and creditors sold my mother the dream of owning land and great wealth. Her pursuit of these endeavors nearly left our family bankrupt, and her massive credit card debt, upwards of $250,000 by the 2000 economic crisis, forced my father to work 60 to 70 hours per week for several years to make up the difference. Even then, he was forced to refinance the house that we lived in twice in order to pay a small portion of the tuition that my sister and I incurred from undergraduate school. It was in college that I was exposed to the 1%. Unlike many of my black, brown, and white peers, I was able to attend an elite college and graduate. During this time, I frolicked in the same institution as our class enemy in the 1%. It drove me into depression. I thought about dropping out more than once." And he talks more and more about it, but that's a quote from him, and it's very revealing. And we have to ask the question, if Glass-Steagall wasn't eliminated, if we had a national health insurance program, if we had a situation where you had, decent wages, for example, would Haifang turn into a communist? If there was no globalist, teabagger, Reaganite, neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, if we didn't have these policies, and we had stakeholder capitalism combined with irrational economic nationalism, there might be a chance that Haifang would have never been a communist. But again, like some of the other quotes of different Communist Party USA leaders and writers who were even thinking about leaving the party, but then saw the depredations of free trade and corporate capitalism, well, that just, emboldened them to stick with the party, the Communist Party USA. And in the case of Danny Haifang, what happened? Turned him against his country, has become in many ways a traitor of the heart, not a de facto. It's a de facto traitor because his loyalties are to global Marxist-Leninist revolution and particularly communist China. But he was driven to that point. It's not because I'm not sure if he's a bad person, a good person, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is people are driven towards communism because of conditions on the ground in societies, in this case, where we have poorly regulated or unregulated corporate capitalism and economic globalism and extreme forms of financialization. There you go. So, again, the best way to combat Marxism, we went over how Marxism is bad. The best way to combat Marxism is not through teabaggery, not through fascism or National Socialism, but it's through stakeholder capitalism, radical civic nationalism, or if you want to call it patriotic populism, that kind of thing. Rational economic nationalism, taking the private sector oligarchs out of the political process. A government, to quote or paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's the way to battle Marxism. Now, there are things I agree with Karl Marx on. His critique of capitalism is not wrong necessarily. So let's go over. I want to read some quotes. Let's see. I just want to find that. Trying to find that. You have to just forgive me for a moment. It's the old gravedigger quote by Mr. Marx. Here we go. Karl Marx said, and this was in the Communist Manifesto, he said, very bluntly, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. There you go. Corporate greed. Uncontrolled capitalism, where there are no checks and balances on unregulated or poorly regulated capitalism, where greed is allowed to run wild. Marx correctly believed that unchecked capitalism, market fundamentalism, because it is unmoored and unchained to any sense of higher morality other than just to garner as much profit as possible, well, it's going to implode. It's self-destructive. It's like its own time bomb, and it's ticking. The teabaggers don't get it, and the Reaganites and the rest of the globalists don't get it. Frankly, the corporate wing of the Democratic Party led by Joe Biden doesn't really get it either, based on Joe Biden's prior voting record as a senator. People like Joe Manchin, who are fighting against the minimum wage increase, as well as, those corporate Democrats like Pelosi and Manchin and a few others that are for these means testing for the COVID relief checks. These are the individuals that are protecting the system from true radical but necessary reforms to ultimately improve the system. So, yes, you see all over, people are on an organized level to a degree, but also on a disorganized level. More and more people are embracing socialism and Marxism. It's growing, as I said. Capitalism is producing its own gravediggers. It's sowing its own seeds of destruction. It's giving itself the rope to hang itself. That's what it's doing. More and more people are discontented. You have more and more people impoverished because the Trump government, which was a teabagger government, a reactionary teabagger government in the thrall of big business in many ways. There was no COVID relief plan really that was far reaching that would carry the United States through and unify the country. There was nothing because Trump catered to the voices who believed in uncontrolled corporate capitalism. They don't believe in plans generally. They believe in shoveling as much money as they can through the PPP program to big corporations with very little to no accountability and crumbs, if anything, to working people, small business people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what's happening. The revolution is growing. It's not because, oh, it's just a communist conspiracy, end of story. No. You do have organized communist groups. People like J.R. Nyquist and Trevor Loudon are correct. The problem is they don't mention that this country is so dysfunctional. We are, by first world standards, a shithole. I'm sorry to say it. I love my country, but I hate what it's become over the past number of decades in many ways. We can do better. And I compare it to my health, for example. I was over 200 pounds. I mean, I could stand up and show you and lost a lot of weight for the, for the past 2.5 years. I've lost like 20 some odd to 30 some odd pounds. I'm down in the mid 160s right now. Why? Because I saw I had a problem. I almost came into a crash course with my life. And then I'm like, oh shit, I got to improve myself. It's either you want to live or die. Country is the same way. You want to live or die. You got to then be humble enough and say, uh-oh, Houston, we got a freaking problem and we got to get to the table and we got to look at policies that work and implement them. But unfortunately, our country is so is infested with this toxic individualism that is weaponized by corporate capitalism, this Ayn Rand nonsense and everything. It's gotten to the point where we have extreme atomism. Everything is all about the political parties and political figures, these mini cults of personality. Trump can't do wrong. Joe Biden can't do wrong. Ted Cruz is God, and all the rest of it, And look, there are a lot of things I like about Bernie Sanders, but he's not immune to my criticism. There are things I'm very critical of him on. And, I'm not one of these people that totally worships the likes of Bernie Sanders either, because I got some serious issues with him to some degree as well. So, we're hopelessly divided. There's really no unifying animating principles guiding our government, guiding our society. And this is where radical civic nationalism will unify the classes, the races, the religions. That's at least something we'd like to strive for. And it's worth it. Otherwise, we're going to continue to rot. I mean, because we are doing it to ourselves. Communists are just there to take advantage of all the problems that we've inflicted on ourselves. So, the people like, Nyquist and others, they're correct in saying that we need a stronger intelligence capability. We absolutely do. But the problem is not just a law enforcement or an intelligence problem. It's a society problem. It's a problem of the economic and political system, which is basically, catering to the interests of the private sector oligarchs. That's really what it is. We're not a democracy. We're a plutocracy or a plutonomy. So, again, this is why I oppose Marxism. This is where these are some of the points where we can then control Marxism. And these are some things I agree with. Again, Marx was correct. Unchecked capitalism produces, above all, its own gravediggers. The rich are becoming richer, especially during the pandemic, because there was no plan to make everyone whole, average citizens, small businesses, etc. I live here in downtown South Florida. There are a number of businesses that have gone out. that are no longer in existence. I mean, the Applebee's off of University Drive, gone, closed, done, goodbye. That's a major restaurant chain right there, even. So this is what's going on. This is what's going on here. And Karl Marx is correct, because we don't have a regime of socialism in this country. This is where I disagree with a lot of otherwise good anti-communist analysts. We don't have socialism. We have unchecked corporate capitalism in this country, pure and simple. And anybody who really thinks that we are in a socialist country or there's creeping socialist country, I'm sorry, you're not being honest. I may like you personally, I may like you on other issues, but frankly, you're flat out wrong on that. So, that's all I have to say about that. The other thing is good old free trade. Free trade. Now, free trade is another form of teabagger Reaganite ideology too as well. It's also infested historically the Democratic Party when it was the party of the slaveholders and the planter plutocracy. It was, quote, in many ways sort of this, quote, conservative type party. Democrats embraced that. And that continued until by about the 1970s. And then you started to have the Democratic Party started to really fracture on the issue of free trade. The establishment, Carter and Clinton and Obama were all very pro-free trade, but different representatives and senators, Sherrod Brown, Marcy Kaptur, to give a few examples, were very critical of free trade. They saw what free trade was doing to our industrial base, and they started to oppose that because it was hurting their constituencies, and it was an affront to their patriotism and to their sense of what they grew up in, America, which was a strong country. Well, Karl Marx wrote about free trade. He noted in 1848, and it's a very well-known quote, "The protective system of our day is conservative." Let me read that again. Mark Levin, teabagger globalist you are on radio. "The protective system of our day is conservative," meaning economic nationalism, protectionism, tariffs. Okay? Why? Because it preserves society. It keeps communities together. Open factories that are humming and running in communities keeps everyone in the same town because there are opportunities, and you get to stay with your families. You get to go to the town church and patronize the town businesses, et cetera, et cetera. It keeps communities together. That's my definition of really what a true conservative is about. It's about protecting society, keeping society together, at least its positive aspects. So anyways, Marx said, "The protective system of our day is conservative, while the free trade system is destructive." Well, look at what NAFTA has done, what all the maquiladoras with Mexico and other transplant factories fleeing overseas, these runaway factories or runaway plants that it used to be called, 60, 70 years ago. That was what the phenomenon was called. Free trade is just look at Detroit. Look at even parts of the South, the textile industries. Despite, right to work, its proponents saying right to work is great, it's going to make us prosperous and reindustrialize the country. Bullshit. It didn't reindustrialize the country. Right to work is just a plot to pay people less. That's all it is. And it was rooted in racism and big business corporate capitalism. That's all what it was. And just look up the history. Look up Vance Muse, for example. You'll understand it. So the bottom line is free trade. You look at what happened in the textile mills in the Carolinas and Georgia. It's just endless. Almost every state in this country has been affected by free trade. So anyways, free trade, it breaks up, as Marx says, free trade breaks up old nationalities and pushes the antagonism of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie to the extreme point. In a word, the free trade system hastens the social revolution. It is in this revolutionary sense alone, gentlemen, that I vote in favor of free trade. Well, here you go. Here you go. Marx is admitting that teabagger neoliberal libertarian free market ideas promotes revolution. It promotes the communist revolution. It breaks up class-based solidarity. It breaks up nationalism. It encourages social atomism and all the rest of it. So conservatives listening to this, abandon the Sean Hannitys, the Mark Levins, Ronald Reagan, and everything, because they are not true conservatives. They are radicals for corporate capitalism. That's really what they are. They are the opposite end of the spectrum of Marxism and fascism, which is totalitarian forms of collectivism. The other side, in the guise of freedom in the Constitution, is just simply unrestrained corporate capitalism where the oligarchs basically own the store. And that favors Marxism. That favors the growth of Marxism. And Karl Marx just said it. So what else do I have to say? I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. So what we need to do, again, we need to look for other solutions. I'm telling you, Marxism is not the solution. Fascism, National Socialism, Marxism, Leninism, if you want to throw that in there, absolutely not the solution. We've seen the historical body count, and the body count still piles up because you still have communist countries that are absolutely ruthless, or communist type dictatorships like in Russia, Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin and the United Russia Party. So it's not the solutions, but this sort of teabagger, Reaganite, globalist corporate capitalism is only going to create plutocracy, and it's only going to piss more and more people off. You have more unrest. The Russians and the Chinese and the Cubans and their other allies are going to take advantage of it in the United States. DSA is going to continue to grow. CPUSA is going to continue to grow. Some of the other communist movements, PSL, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which is another sort of tanky, hardline Marxist-Leninist group, they're growing. They garnered in Florida. They garnered a ridiculous number of votes in the last presidential election in November 2020. I forget the statistic, but it was like incredible. I mean, we're dealing with thousands of people in Florida. And unsurprisingly, they garnered a lot of votes in Illinois. You know, Chicago is a stronghold of far left political influences, and certainly California, they got a lot of votes too as well. But, you know, think about it. When the whole system collapses because of teabag or unregulated global corporate capitalism and reactionary anti-labor hating and plutocratic government, when it all eventually collapses and there's such a disparity in wealth, you know, a couple of 10,000, let's say 200,000 leftists, and they know how to organize. Some of these groups really know how to organize, and they are guided by Lenin. And Leninism, its chief achievement it's the theology of not only power, but it's theology of seizing power and organizing for the revolution. And remember, in Russia, under the provisional government, by the dawn of the Bolshevik Revolution, there were only 200,000 Bolsheviks in a country where you had almost 100 million people as a population. But they took power, and it was a huge landmass, bigger than the United States. It could happen here if we don't do the right things, if we don't have the reforms from above, rather than class-based revolution. We need to stake out a third position, a third way between collectivist totalitarianism on one spectrum and teabagger reactionary capitalism, globalism on the other hand. This is where radical civic nationalism or patriotic populism comes into play. And I want to thank you for listening to this program. I'm probably going to do another live stream later this evening where I'm going to be talking about just some news items, interesting quotes, historical quotes that I came across as some books. I want to do that from time to time in some of my solo live broadcasts. But again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my coffee, and I will see you all later.